So time for an update video. It's been 6 months since the last one I made. I apologize about that. I've been really busy with a lot of other things, but also busy with the car. Made a lot of progress since the last video, but also I had a lot of stuff come up this summer. It's been crazy. So Power Tour actually got canceled. So I've just kind of had this thing on the back burner lately. So I've obviously got a lot more time till next year now to get this thing built. But anyways, back to the car. Here it is. Got the engine and transmission in it. Basically, when we put it in, I bolted the transmission to the back of the engine with the torque converter and everything on, and jacked the back end of the car all the way up as high as I could get it, and put the jack stands all the way up. I also had to jack up the front end just a little bit to get the engine hoist underneath it, and I did it without taking the front header panel off, which a lot of people have to change. I did scratch it just a little bit because that's how close we were. But I do actually have an 85 and newer front clip for this. It's kind of got the flush mounted blinker lights. I don't really like how these look recessed in here, and it's also got a different shin spoiler for the front of it. But that's just kind of a preference thing. I did get the heads from the 5.3 swapped on. They're 862 casting number. Same thing as 706, except there's some cracking issues and stuff with the 706. That's why I use the 862s. Other than that, I didn't change really anything. I did put the camshaft in it, that Elgin 1840, or sloppy stage 2 as it's kind of known as. Another thing you'll notice, I found this LS2 intake on Facebook Marketplace and ended up buying that. I think I paid like $150 for it. Came with the fuel rail and the injectors. I sent the injectors out to Eric Durr in Kentucky, and he flowed and cleaned them for me. Everything is all good to go for those. Running also basically, since it's got the lower car intake on it now, I found that, and it's perfect for this because the truck intakes are really close to the hood. But since I'm running that, I've got a drive-by cable throttle body bolted up to, it's a 4-bolt intake since it's off of an LS2. But this is an LS3 water pump off of like a 2010 Camaro I ordered. You need that because the truck water pumps don't clear the intake if you use a low slung, like a car intake of any kind. So I bought that off Rock Auto. It's an AC Delco unit. Also got the tensioner for that using the ICT billet plates from Matt Walter for the power this is like the bracket for the power steering. Uses the stock truck pump, and down there you can see it. I did have to drill a hole in the block for one of the bolts for the alternator, but there's the alternator down there that uses the 4-pin plug. So hindsight 2020, if I would have known that I couldn't use the accessories I had. So what happened is I had the power steering pump from the 06 Denali that I got the engine out of, and also the alternator out of it. But the Denali's used a hydro boost system, so the power steering pump was different and had extra fittings on it. So I ended up buying a stock 5.3, like regular standard brake power steering pump, and also the 4-pin alternator because the Denali had a 2-pin alternator. And I bought this harness from Matt Happel at Sloppy Mechanics for the Holly, and basically that's just the exciter wire, and that's what I had. So I just got a 4-pin too. But kind of hindsight 2020, if I would have known that I was going to be getting all new power steering, alternator, and water pump anyways, I could have just gone with the LS1 stuff that sits further back to the engine, and it's a little nicer, neater setup. But it is what it is, and I have it. This will function just fine. Also decided to upgrade to basically that's a solid steering shaft, and it's out of an Astro van. So the steering shafts on these from the factory 3rd gen ones, to have like a rag joint right here, and they were sloppy. They're notoriously pretty sloppy. Mine was really bad, so I decided to change that out. Using the stock, it's a stock power steering line for like a Silverado that does not have Hydro Boost. So this is like off of, I think I told the parts guy, like an 02 Silverado with a 5.3 for the part, for the steering line there. I'll get part numbers and everything here. I'll get a list made up. But also, you may notice I said the Holley. I decided to upgrade to the Holley Terminator X engine management system. It is basically like a standalone computer sitting actually right down here that runs the engine. So what you buy is the computer, and it comes with the harnesses and everything to make it not bolt on, but everything plugs right in then on the engine. All you have to figure out is the starter wire and the alternator. That's why I bought that little additional harness for the alternator. But with everything that comes with this, you plug in, this is a switched on with the key power source, and that's basically like a wire that just tells the computer when to turn on when the key's on. And then it comes with a power tap, which is I think they're 10 or 12 gauge wires that power the ECU. Those go to the battery, and then there's 2 harnesses that come off the engine. That's these 2 right here, and then I don't have them hooked up yet, but right there is the harnesses for the transmission. So the 4L80 is an electronically shifted transmission. So that's all the wiring that comes from the transmission. I got to route that over to the computer. I don't have that hooked up yet. But since I wanted to do a little startup video today, it'll be fine the way it is. I haven't done the cooler yet either for the transmission. I just have that kind of hooked together so it doesn't leak all over the place. Also ran basically like a power tap right here, power distribution center. That runs, so the alternator, I've got a 4 gauge wire coming off the alternator because the factory 3rd gen one was like a 10 gauge and the alternator was way less power back then. So with the more modern alternator that puts out a lot more power, I ran a 4 gauge wire down to the alternator, ran that up to this power distribution center, and then also ran a 4 gauge cable from here over to the battery. So now I've got power here. I ran the fuse box right here. This is the fuse for the fan, and this is the fuse for the fuel pump. So basically the Holley has a wire that comes off of it it's for a smaller fuel pump. So if you wanted to, if you have a smaller fuel pump, if it's just like a stock setup, you can take that wire, run it straight to the fuel pump. I use that as a trigger because I used a 12 gauge wire for powering the fuel pump because I have that larger fuel pump in here to run the fuel injection. So I ran basically like the power trigger wire over here and used it to trigger this relay. And I've got a 12 gauge wire coming from the power tap here over like through, it's actually this wire right here that goes all the way back to the fuel pump. Other than that, the Holley has these inputs and outputs, which is a bunch of different capabilities that it has. So I have this wired to the fan, and basically it tells, you can control through the Holley computer, you can tell it to when you want to turn on the fans, when you want to turn off the fans, and like different temperatures and stuff. So I'm using the stock 3rd gen radiator with the stock 3rd gen fan. I haven't heard very good things about these. I might have to end up upgrading these, but I have not run the car yet. Well, I did run it for like a minute, but other than that, I haven't run it up to temperature yet. So we're going to do a startup today and see how it goes, if it gets warm or if the fan kicks on or what. So I haven't tested any of the fan or anything yet. So we're going to see how that pans out. Had to run some longer heater core hoses to get them to work with this LS3 water pump. So they're the same size as the old ones. I just had to run longer lines because it's lower mounted than the factory setup. Actually, like 2 days after I got the Holley in the mail is when I found this intake online too. So I also had to get there's a harness in here that's the injector harness. So I had to get a different injector harness just because the LS2, the LS2 injectors are different than the truck injectors. They have a different plug on them. So it's real simple to change. It's just this plug. Basically, it's just got 8 plugs on it, and they're all labeled. Every sensor on here, every plug is labeled. It's super easy to install it. I plugged the whole thing together in probably an hour. And that's coils, injectors, all the different sensors on everything, all the power taps and everything to get the computer powered up. And then also the transmission plug. I did mention that in the last video. I had to massage the firewall a little bit on basically on the driver's side, right where the plug is for the transmission, to get that to plug in. I did decide when I was putting the transmission and engine together that I was going to get a stall converter for this instead of just the stock converter, which was my original plan. So I ended up getting it's actually the Summit Performance. It's a 32 to 3400 stall converter. So it should drive relatively well yet, since it's going to be a street car for the most part. But I've heard from other people that it should drive just fine, so I'm not too worried about that. Also running an oil catch can setup here. That's just to keep oil out of the intake pretty much. So I have that routed over to the PCV, and then also have that routed up to this port on the intake. So it is drawing vacuum through there. Other than that, running I forgot to mention this too, I've got the stock small block 3rd gen engine, like the clamshell mounts for the engine. So I put new mounts, new rubber mounts in, and then with the ICT billet plate from Matt Walter, or you can buy them anywhere online, it allows this stock small block Chevy engine plate to bolt right to the LS engine. So for this application, I got them slid all the way forward because there's not a lot of clearance between the oil pan and the cross member under there. So I got them slid all the way forward, and it worked out perfect. It actually is kind of tight under there. I might end up having to go with some solid mounts, but for right now, it is awesome, and there's enough clearance should be fine to run the engine and drive the car. I don't have a drive shaft for it yet, but we're just going to be doing a fire up video today. Trying to think of anything else. Oh yeah, the PA Racing cross member. I mentioned that in the last video. That's what I used to mount the transmission, and using also their torque arm. Other than that, trying to think here. I think I covered everything. So I'm going to push this thing outside and we're going to fire it up. I'll just have a little uncut startup video then for running this thing up to temperature. One other thing I'm going to mention here too, I forgot to say this before. The Holley computer is actually a complete standalone unit, so you don't need to have anything. As long as you have all the sensors in your engine, and basically you have everything to hook it up to. The computer comes with a harness, everything plugs right in, and then it's got this little handheld that you can use. Basically, you can look at all the engine vitals and everything. You can data log and everything through this. There's a little SD card on it. You can change the tune. One other thing I forgot to mention too about when I first started this thing up, I actually did not really look into the power steering lines. So the power steering pump that was on the small block, I bought this car as a complete roller, but the power steering pump was still hooked up and it was just kind of looped off to the side. When I started this thing up for the first time, basically I just kind of went over here and reached through the steering wheel, and I didn't realize that before the last guy had the power steering lines hooked up backwards. So I had them hooked up backwards too. When I cranked this thing over and it started, the steering wheel turned all the way to the left really fast because it was on jack stands, and actually caught me in the wrist, and I didn't know if it was broken or anything, but ended up being all right. It was just bruised pretty bad. But yeah, so make sure your power steering lines are hooked up straight when you swap anything or really anything if you're hooking up new lines. But I'm gonna get this set up on the truck here, and we'll get this thing started up.